The thing nobody tells you about the end of the world is that it can arrive without a single sound. No sirens, no screaming, just the air conditioner shutting off, and the sudden awareness that you'd been living inside a noise your whole life without ever hearing it. I noticed it at 2:14 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I'd been staring at the microwave clock, waiting for a burrito that had 30 seconds left. And then the numbers were gone, and the plate stopped spinning, and the whole house exhaled and went still. My name is Dale Ferris. I was 46 years old, a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company, and the single most unremarkable man on Alder Ridge Court. I want that on the record before any of this makes me sound like someone I'm not. I had no plan. I had no skills. I had a wife named Renata, who took 2 pills a day to keep her heart in rhythm. A 19-year-old daughter named Priya, who was home from her first year of college and furious about it. And a thermostat that had just stopped meaning anything. "Power's out," Priya called from the living room like I couldn't tell. "It'll come back," I said. That was the first lie of many, and the only one I told without knowing it was a lie. Outside, the sun sat on our subdivision like a hand pressing down. It had been 106 the day before. The forecast for that afternoon was 108, and the weather app on my phone, before the phone became a paperweight, had shown a little animated flame next to the number, as if the software itself found it funny. We lived in the kind of place built entirely around the assumption that the electricity would never stop. Stucco houses with black shingle roofs baking in a valley an hour east of the city. Windows sealed shut because they were decorative. No attic vents worth the name. Every home a sealed box designed to be cooled from the inside. Take away the cooling and you don't have a house. You have an oven with furniture in it. I didn't understand that yet. I went to the garage and found the breaker box and flipped things off and on with the confidence of a man who has watched other men do it. Nothing. The little green lights on the surge protector by my workbench were dead. My phone, when I checked it, had 1 bar, and then, over the next hour, none, not because the battery died, but because the towers did. The whole invisible web I'd lived inside, going dark, strand by strand, while I stood in my garage flipping a switch that no longer connected to anything. I should tell you what kind of man I was before, because it matters to what I became. I was a careful man. I bought the extended warranty. I kept a spare key in a fake rock that fooled nobody. I had never in my life run out of gas, missed a payment, or been in a fight. I had built an entire existence around the removal of risk. And the great irony of my profession was that I did the same thing for other people all day, sat with them after the flood, after the fire, and translated their catastrophe into a settlement figure, a number that made the unbearable administrable. I was good at it. I believed, without ever saying it, that most disasters were survivable if you just kept your head and did the paperwork. I stepped out into the cul-de-sac, and that's where I saw the first sign that no paperwork was going to fix this, that this was not a normal outage. Every house was quiet, not one condenser unit humming, not one generator. And down at the corner, where Alder Ridge met the main road, 3 cars were stopped in the intersection at angles that made no sense. Doors open, one of them still gently rolling into the curb. I raised my hand to wave at the driver of the nearest one. He was standing beside it, facing away from me, swaying a little on his feet like a man who'd stood up too fast. "You okay over there?" I called. He turned around. And even from 150 feet, in the flattening white light of that afternoon, I could see that something was very wrong with his face, and that whatever it was not going to be fixed by the power coming back on. I didn't run. That's the part I'm least proud of and most honest about. I stood in my own driveway and I stared at that man the way you stare at a wasp that's landed on your arm. Some animal part of your brain insisting that if you don't move, the danger won't notice you. He took a step in my direction, then another. His gait was wrong, too loose in the joints, like a marionette carried by someone who didn't care about it. It was Priya who moved. She'd come out onto the porch behind me, phone already up out of reflex, and she said, "Dad," in a voice I had never heard from her, a voice with the bottom dropped out of it. "Dad, get inside." The man at the corner opened his mouth and made a sound like a hinge. We got inside. I want to say I herded my family to safety with steady hands. But the truth is, Priya pulled me by the sleeve and I stumbled over the threshold, and Renata was already at the front window with the blinds pinched open. And the three of us stood in our own entryway, breathing like we'd run a mile. Renata's face had gone the color of paper. "I saw it on my phone before it died," she said. "There were videos. I thought it was a hoax or a movie or..." She stopped. She pressed her hand flat against her chest, over the heart that needed the pills, and I watched her make herself breathe slower on purpose. "It's real then?" "We don't know what it is," I said. "Dale." She looked at me. 22 years of marriage in one look. "We know enough." We locked the doors, and we drew every blind, and we pushed the couch against the front door. Because that's what you do, that's what the movies taught us. And for about an hour, it felt like we had done something. We had made the house safe. We had sealed ourselves in. I keep coming back to that hour, because it was the last time all three of us believed the same wrong thing at the same time. We believed the danger was outside. We believed the walls were on our side. We sat in the darkened living room with the couch against the door, and the man from the corner occasionally visible through the blinds, drifting up and down the street. And we felt the specific relief of people who think they've solved their problem. During that hour, we made plans that all assumed the same thing. Priya wanted to know how long the food in the fridge would last. We agreed to eat the perishable things first. Renata wanted the flashlights gathered in one place. We gathered them. I wanted to know where the man from the corner had gone. I checked the blinds every few minutes and reported his position like a sentry. We were organized. We were calm. We were, I see now, doing all the right things for a siege, and none of the right things for what was actually happening. Because a siege is a problem of keeping something out. And our problem was going to be that we'd sealed something in. It was already 90 degrees inside the house. We just didn't know it yet, because we were still cool from the air conditioning that had run until 2:14. The heat was coming in the way debt comes in quietly, on a delay. And then all at once, the walls we'd sealed ourselves behind weren't keeping the heat out. They were keeping it in. Every hour that sun sat on our black roof, the house drank in temperature and held it. And with the doors shut and the windows that didn't open and 3 warm bodies breathing inside it, the box we'd locked ourselves into had already begun, very patiently, to cook us. Priya was the first to say it out loud. She fanned her collar and said, "Is it just me, or is it getting hot in here?" None of us answered, because it wasn't just her. By 6 o'clock that first evening, the thermometer on the kitchen wall, an old analog thing shaped like a rooster that Renata's mother had given us, and that I had mocked for a decade, read 94 degrees. Inside, with the sun going down. I remember laughing at it, actually. A short, ugly laugh. Because I'd spent my entire adult career calculating risk for a living. I'd sat across kitchen tables from people whose houses had burned or flooded, and I'd told them, gently, what they were and weren't covered for. I knew the actuarial tables. I knew that heat kills more Americans in a normal year than floods and tornadoes and hurricanes combined, and that it kills them quietly, indoors, old and young and sick, in exactly the kind of sealed suburban box I was standing in. I knew all of that as a number. I had never once known it as a fact about my own family. The heat did something to the house I hadn't expected. It changed the smells. By evening, the place had begun to exhale odors. It had kept politely hidden for years the warm plastic of electronics, the faint sourness of the refrigerator gasket, the particular mustiness of carpet that had never once been asked to endure a temperature like this. The refrigerator itself had become a coffin for our food, a sealed box slowly warming toward spoilage. And I opened it only twice that whole first day. And each time, the cool that spilled out felt like a theft from the future. I walked the house before dark, room by room, the way I'd walked strangers' damaged houses my whole career, cataloging. Every window, sealed, decorative, immovable. The sliding door to the back patio opened, but the patio faced west and held the day's heat like a skillet. The bathrooms had no exterior vents. The whole structure had been engineered as a closed system, beautiful and efficient and utterly dependent on a machine that no longer ran. And standing in my own hallway, I understood I was inside a device that had lost the only function that made it survivable. "We need to think about water," I said. Renata was already ahead of me. She'd filled the 2 big stock pots and every pitcher we owned, and she was standing at the sink testing the tap, which still ran the town's water towers, were gravity-fed, she reminded me. They'd hold pressure for a while, even with the pumps dead. "Drink it while it's cold," she said. "It won't be cold much longer." Priya sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets, phone dark in her hand, and I could see her doing the thing 19-year-olds do when the ground moves under them, trying to be casual about it, trying to make it small. So we just what? Wait for it to come back on? Somebody's going to fix the grid, right? This is a whole city. "Somebody's going to try," I said. "That's not the same thing." "No," I admitted. "It's not." Here is what I understood by the end of that first night. Sitting in the dark with a rooster thermometer refusing to drop below 90. My wife rationing cold water like it was medicine because for her it half was. My daughter pretending she wasn't scared. The infected outside were a problem I could see. They were slow. There were, so far, not many. If one got in, I could deal with it, or die dealing with it. And either way it would be fast, and it would be a thing that happened. The heat was different. The heat wasn't a thing that would happen. It was a thing that was already happening. To all 3 of us, at the same steady rate. And there was no couch I could push against it, and no door I could lock to keep it out. It had come in through the walls, and it had sat down with us, and it was not going to leave. I lay next to Renata on top of the covers, both of us slick with sweat by 10 p.m. And I listened to her breathing, and I counted it against the sound of the man from the corner shuffling somewhere out on the street. And I understood for the first time in my comfortable, climate-controlled, actuarially insured life that I had been afraid of exactly the wrong thing. The sun came up on the first full day like it had a grudge. I'd slept maybe 2 hours, in pieces, and I woke because Renata wasn't beside me and there was a sound coming from the bathroom. I found her sitting on the edge of the tub in the gray early light, the cold tap running over her wrists, her face doing something careful and controlled that I recognized as pain being managed. "Palpitations," she said before I could ask. "It's the heat. It makes my heart..." She turned her wrist over under the water. It's fine. I took my morning pill. I just need to stay cool. Stay cool. Two words that had meant nothing my whole life, that had been a figure of speech, a thing you told an angry man in a parking lot. Now they were a medical instruction, and I had no way to follow it. The rooster thermometer read 88 when I checked at the overnight low. The coolest the house would be all day, and it was already warmer than any thermostat I'd ever set. From here, the only direction was up. Priya was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a bag of frozen peas from a freezer that was no longer freezing anything, pressing it to the back of her neck. The peas had gone soft. She'd figured out on her own that the freezer was now just an insulated box holding the last of the cold, and she'd started treating everything in it as a resource with a clock on it. I looked at my daughter who 3 days ago had been annoyed that our house didn't have faster internet rationing, thawing vegetables against her own body temperature. And something in me that had been slack my whole life pulled tight. "Okay," I said. "We're going to be smart about this." I said it like I knew how. I didn't. But I'd spent my career watching how disasters actually hurt people, and one thing I did know was that people rarely died from the disaster itself. They died from the second thing, the choices made in the hours after, the panic, the bad math. So I made us sit down at the table, the three of us, in the rising heat, and I made us think. We had water for now. We had food that didn't need cooking. We had a battery radio that Renata, God bless her, had bought years ago, and I had rolled my eyes at. And we had a house that was actively working against us, that got hotter every hour the sun was up, that had no cross breeze because the windows didn't open, and no shade because some developer had clear-cut the lot in 1998 to fit one more unit on the street. "The garage," Priya said suddenly. "The garage is cooler. Concrete floor. It's on the north side." She was right. It was the first genuinely useful idea any of us had, and it came from the kid. And I felt a flush of something that wasn't the heat. I'd spent 19 years thinking of Priya as someone I had to keep safe. A person things happen to. And in one sentence about concrete floors and north-facing walls, she'd become a person who noticed things, who solved. She saw me register it and she rolled her eyes, but she was pleased, I could tell. And God help me even in the middle of all that I was proud of her. This new stranger who'd been living in my house behind the face of my child. We moved down into the garage that morning, the three of us and the water and the radio. We laid out beach towels on the bare concrete and lay flat on them with our arms and legs spread like people making snow angels in reverse, pulling the coolness up out of the slab and into our overheated bodies. I taught them the trick I'd read once in a claim file from a man who'd survived a Phoenix outage. Soak a shirt, wring it half out, drape it over the back of the neck where the big blood vessels run close to the skin. It worked. For a few hours, on that concrete, with wet shirts on our necks and the sun locked outside the garage door, it was almost bearable. Then, a little after noon, I heard glass break 2 houses down, and a woman start to scream. And I learned that the infected were the least of the reasons a person might come to your door. The screaming came from the Okonkwo's place. Grace Okonkwo was a retired school teacher, 70-something, who lived alone with a rescue greyhound and brought us tomatoes she couldn't possibly eat by herself. I knew her name. I knew her dog's name. It was Biscuit. In 8 years, I'd never once been inside her house. That's suburbia for you. You can live 40 feet from a person for the better part of a decade and know nothing about their life, except the shape of their kindnesses. I went out. I want to be clear that I didn't want to. Every cell in my body wanted to stay on that cool, concrete floor with my family. But Renata looked at me, and Priya looked at me, and I was the man of a house that had spent the last 20 hours discovering it was not a fortress. And I think I needed to be useful at something before the heat made all of us useless. The screaming was Grace, and it wasn't the infected. It was worse in a way I hadn't prepared for. There was a man in her front yard, someone I didn't recognize, young and sun-scorched and wild-eyed. And he was dragging a case of bottled water off her porch while she stood in her doorway and begged him to stop. He wasn't sick. He was just faster than she was, and thirstier than he was decent. "Hey!" I shouted. It came out higher than I meant. "Hey, put it down!" He looked at me. And this is the thing I keep turning over. He wasn't a monster. He was maybe 25. He had a lanyard around his neck from some job, a normal life crumpled up in his pocket somewhere. He looked at me with an expression that was pure animal calculation. Is this man a threat? Can he take what I have? How much do I want to find out? And then he decided I wasn't worth it. And he took Grace's water and he ran, cutting between houses, gone. I stood in the street shaking, not from fear of him, from what I'd seen in his face, which was a preview of what all of us were about to become. 3 days without power in that heat, and the polite fiction of the suburb was already peeling off people like sunburned skin. The infected shuffled. But the living were going to run, and take, and calculate, and the walls that couldn't keep the heat out couldn't keep them out either. Grace was standing in her doorway when I reached her, one hand on the frame, breathing too hard. And I saw immediately that the robbery was almost beside the point. She'd been alone in that heat for 2 days with a dog and a heart that was 71 years old. And the young man with the lanyard hadn't stolen her survival, so much as revealed how thin it already was. Biscuit pressed against her legs. That abused greyhound crouch, ready to be hit for a crime he hadn't committed. "I'm all right," she said, which was the first thing everyone said and never once true. "He only took the water. I have more. I have—" She looked back into her dim, sweltering house, and I watched her do the arithmetic and come up short. She didn't have more, not enough. Nobody did. I got Grace and Biscuit into our garage. I didn't ask Renata first. I just did it. Because leaving a 70-year-old woman alone in a house that had just been robbed, in that heat, would have been a kind of murder I couldn't have lived beside. Renata took one look at Grace's flushed face and unsteadiness, and went into nurse mode she didn't know she had, getting water into her, getting her onto the coolest part of the floor. Priya knelt and let Biscuit smell her hand and waited, patient, until the dog decided she was safe. And when he finally leaned his bony weight against her, I saw my daughter's face do something it hadn't done since the power died soften. "That was kind," Renata said to me quietly, later. And then, because she was honest, and because she loved me. It was also one more person breathing our air and drinking our water in a house that's killing us. I need you to know that I know both of those things are true. By the end of the first full day, the rooster read 101 degrees inside our house. I moved it down to the garage and it dropped to 94 on the concrete, and that 9-degree difference was the whole reason we were still functional. We ran the radio in short bursts to save the batteries. It was mostly static, and one automated emergency band repeating the same message. Shelter in place, remain indoors, conserve water, await instructions. Shelter in place. I laughed the ugly laugh again. Whoever recorded that message had been sitting in an air-conditioned room. Sheltering in place, indoors, was the single most dangerous thing we could do. And the official voice of the disaster was ordering us to do it. because the plan had been written for a different disaster, one where inside was safe and the walls were on your side. Once, briefly, we caught a human voice, a ham operator, somewhere out in the valley, reading names of the missing and the safe into the dark, a roll call for a world that had lost its census. He read for maybe 10 minutes, and then the batteries dipped and I clicked it off. And the silence after his voice was worse than the silence before it. Because now we knew there were other people out there, in the heat, doing the same math, losing the same gambles, and no way for any of us to reach each other. If you've ever sat in a dark room listening to a stranger's voice be the only proof that the world still exists, you know the specific loneliness of clicking it off to save the batteries. Priya asked me to leave it on. I said no. It was the right call, and it felt like a small murder. That night, I couldn't sleep, and I sat up with Grace, who couldn't either. She told me things in the dark. She told me she'd taught 4th grade for 31 years. She told me Biscuit had been abused before she got him, and still flinched at raised hands. She told me her husband had died in this same house, in the winter, warm and comfortable, and that she'd always thought she'd go the same way, and that she'd never once imagined the house itself turning on her. You know what I keep thinking? She said. All those years I complained about the electric bill. Every summer, muttered about it like it was a crime against me. She smiled at the wall. I'd pay it 10 times over right now. 100. I'd give everything I own to hear that air conditioner come on. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? Outside, somewhere, one of the infected made its hinge sound. And closer, in the house, I heard Renata shift in her sleep and her breath catch that small hitch that meant her heart had skipped. The heat reaching in through the walls to touch the one part of her I most needed to protect and could do absolutely nothing to reach. 101 degrees inside, 2 more days of sun still coming. My wife's heart stuttering in the dark. And I lay there and did the math I'd done 1,000 times for strangers. The cold actuarial arithmetic of survival. Except this time, the numbers had my family's names on them. And for the first time in my career, the answer the math gave me was one I could not accept. On the morning of the 2nd day, Renata fainted. She was standing at the sink. The tap was down to a thin, warm trickle now. The water towers finally running dry, and she just folded, quietly, without drama, the way she did everything. Priya caught her halfway down. We got her onto the concrete, and I fanned her with a cutting board. And Grace, 70 years old and stronger than she looked, held Renata's wrist and counted and told me the number. And I watched Grace's face while she counted, and I saw her decide not to tell me something. What? I said. Her pulse is fast, Grace said, and it's not steady. Dale, she's a heart patient in a 100-degree house. This is exactly the situation those pills are trying to prevent, and the heat is stronger than the pills. I had known, abstractly, that the heat was the enemy. Now it had a specific target, and the target was the center of my entire life. Renata came around after a minute, embarrassed, insisting she was fine. And I let her insist because letting her keep her dignity was one of the last things I could still give her. But over her head, Grace and I looked at each other, and the look said what neither of us would say in front of Renata. She cannot stay in this heat. And there was nowhere in that house, on that street, that wasn't this heat. I made Renata drink, small sips, constant, the way Grace instructed. I fanned her with a cutting board until my arm cramped, and then Priya took over without a word. And we passed the cutting board back and forth for an hour, like it was the most important object in the world, which for that hour it was. Renata kept apologizing. That's the thing about the people who hold a family together. even fainting on a garage floor. Her first instinct was to say sorry for the trouble, and I had to tell her twice to stop, that there was no trouble, that keeping her alive was not a favor I was doing, but the entire remaining purpose of my existence. But I could see the arithmetic in Grace's face, and I could feel it in the temperature of the concrete, which even in the north side garage had climbed 2 degrees since morning, as the whole earth around the house soaked in more heat than it could shed overnight. We were not holding steady. We were losing slowly, and the slowest thing to lose was the most dangerous, because it let you believe you had time. That's when the plan started to form, the terrible plan, the one that broke every instinct I had, because there was one place I knew for a fact was cooler. I'd seen it the day of the robbery, cutting my eyes across the street the way you do. The Vance's house, 2 doors down. The family that snowbirded, gone since May. A big house, north-facing, deep-set, with something I'd been staring at for 2 days, without letting myself understand a whole home generator. The kind rich people install and forget, sitting silent on a concrete pad beside their garage. Silent because no one was home to run it. Or maybe silent because it too had failed. I didn't know. From my driveway I couldn't tell. But I knew this. If that generator worked, there was a cool house 40 yards away, empty, and my wife's heart was failing in the heat of mine. "I know what you're thinking," Priya said. She'd followed my eyes. "The Vances. I'm thinking about it. That's breaking in. That's Dad. That's stealing. That's stealing from people who aren't even here to say no." "Yes," I said. "It is exactly that." And there it was, sitting between us on the hot concrete. Not a choice between good and evil, which is easy, but the real kind. The kind the disaster actually served up. Break into an absent family's home and take what was theirs. Become the young man with the lanyard. Become the thing that had frightened me most, or keep my hands clean, and stay in the honest heat of my own house, and watch my wife's heart give out one skipped beat at a time. I want to walk through exactly how I talked myself into it, because I think the talking into is the whole story of who a person becomes in a thing like this. First, I told myself the Vances would want us to. Good people. I'd waved at them 100 times. Surely they'd say, "Take it, save your wife." But I didn't know the Vances. I'd never had a conversation with them longer than a comment about the weather. And how strange that word felt now. Weather, the polite small talk topic that had become the thing trying to kill us. I was inventing their permission because I needed it. Then I told myself it was survival, and survival suspends the rules. But I'd watched the lanyard man tell himself the same thing while he took a widow's water. And I'd hated him for it. And the only difference between us was that my need had a sicker person attached to it. Need is need. Everyone's is the biggest one in the world to them. Then I stopped lying and just looked at the truth, which was this. I was going to do it. Not because it was right, because Renata's pulse was fast and unsteady, and I loved her more than I cared about being a good man. That was the actual reason. Stripped of everything I'd dressed it in, I would rather be a thief with a living wife than an honest man with a dead one. And if that makes me a certain kind of person, then the heat made me that kind of person. And I've stopped pretending otherwise. I told Renata I owed her that. I would not save her life by becoming someone she didn't know while she was unconscious. She listened, lying on the concrete with a wet cloth on her forehead. And when I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "If you do this," she said finally, "you do it clean. You take only what keeps us alive. You leave everything else. You leave a note with our name on it, saying what we took, and that we'll pay it back. You do not let this turn you into someone who takes, because he can." She gripped my hand with more strength than a fainting woman should have had. "The heat can have my heart before it has your character. Do you understand me? That's the thing I actually can't survive losing." I understood. It didn't change what I was going to do, but it changed how. And I've come to believe that in a collapse, the how is the only thing you get to keep. When everything else is stripped away, the power, the plans, the polite fictions of the street, what's left is the manner in which you do the unavoidable thing. And that manner is either yours or it isn't. The lanyard man had done a necessary thing in a way that made him a predator. I was going to do a necessary thing. And Renata was insisting, from the floor, with her failing heart, that I find a way to do it that let me stay a person. I have thought since that this was the most useful thing anyone said to me in 3 days, more useful than the concrete floor or the wet shirts or the generator card, because it was the only instruction that was about survival of a kind that would still matter after the trucks came. Grace overheard us. She was lying nearby with Biscuit, and she said without opening her eyes, "She's right, you know. My husband used to say character isn't what you do when it's easy. It's what's left of you after you've done the hard thing." She smiled faintly. He was an insufferable man to argue with. He was usually right, too. We went at dusk, when the infected were harder to see, but so were we. When the sun was finally off that black roof Priya and me. Because 2 could carry more, and because she refused, flatly, to let me go alone. Grace stayed with Renata, and we crossed 40 yards of open cul-de-sac in 104-degree twilight toward a stranger's dark house. To steal the cold air my family needed to live. And every step of it, I was listening for the hinge sound. And not once did it occur to me until we were at the Vance's door that the infected might have gotten inside first. The Vance's back door was locked, and I broke a pane of glass with a garden rock. And the sound of it in that dead quiet neighborhood was the loudest thing I'd ever done. Priya grabbed my arm. We froze. Somewhere down the street, the hinge sound answered one of them had heard, was turning, was coming, slow but coming. Inside, the house was blessedly, impossibly cooler. Deep-set, north-facing, blinds drawn since May by people who understood their own home. 12 degrees cooler than my garage. Easy. It felt like walking into water. And for one dangerous second, I understood exactly how comfort could kill you. How you could stand in that cool dark and never want to leave it. How the young man with the lanyard had probably felt this same animal relief and let it eat his decency. I made myself move deeper into the house instead of standing in that cool dark forever, and everywhere I looked, there was the evidence of people who had simply left a calendar still turned to May. A bowl of ornamental fruit, a child's drawing held to the refrigerator by a magnet shaped like a sunflower. A whole life paused that I was about to walk through and take from. I kept Renata's rule in my head like a railing. Only what keeps us alive. Leave everything else. Leave a note. I said it out loud in the dark, actually. Whispered it. Because I could feel how easy it would be to let the taking spread once it started. How the first justified theft opens a door in you that the second and third walk through without asking. The generator was the mission. I found it through the garage, a natural gas standby unit. And natural gas, unlike the electric grid, was still in the lines, still pressured. It hadn't run because it was on manual override. The Vances had switched it off before they left so it wouldn't cycle all summer. It wasn't broken. It had simply been turned off by careful people, and all I had to do was turn it on. There was a laminated card taped inside the panel with the startup sequence written in a neat hand. And I stood there reading a stranger's careful instructions to himself. A man I'd never spoken to reaching across months to show me how to save my wife. And I had to stop and breathe before I could see the switch through my eyes. My hands were shaking so hard, it took 3 tries to flip the transfer switch. And then the unit coughed and caught and roared to life, and every light in the Vance's house came on at once. And the central air kicked in with a sound so beautiful, I nearly wept. And 40 yards away in the darkness, I heard not one hinge sound, but several. Because the roar of that generator in a silent, dead world was a dinner bell, and I had just rung it. "Dad," Priya was at the window. "Dad, they heard it. They're coming. There's, I count 4, 5. Here was the trap I'd built with my own hands. The cool house was real. It was right here, generator running, air conditioning flooding the rooms. Everything Renata's heart needed. But it was 2 doors from my family, across open ground. And I'd just announced its existence to every infected thing within earshot. I could stay here, safe and cool and alone, and let the sound draw them here, away from my house, where Renata and Grace waited. Or I could shut it off, plunge us back into merciful silence and lethal heat, and lose the only thing that could save my wife. I didn't shut it off. I made the other choice, the one I'll be explaining to myself for the rest of my life. I left it running. And I told Priya we were going to bring the family to the cool house instead of bringing the cool house to the family, and that meant moving Renata, a fainting heart patient, and Grace and a traumatized greyhound across 40 yards of open cul-de-sac in the dark, toward a beacon I'd just lit for the dead. We ran back across first, Priya and me, low and fast, and the infected were still converging on the Vances. So the sound had pulled them, exactly as I'd feared, exactly as I'd hoped. Because every one of them drifting toward that generator was one not drifting toward my front door. I burst into my own garage, and the heat hit me like a wall after the Vances cool 100 degrees still, at 9 at night, the house holding the day's fire in its walls like a grudge. Renata was sitting up. Grace had her hand. "It works," I gasped. "The generator works. There's cool air, real cool air, 2 doors down. But we have to go now. We have to go while they're distracted by the sound. And I knelt in front of her. "You have to walk. I can't carry you fast enough. I need your heart to give me 40 yards. Can you give me 40 yards? My wife looked at me, and she did the bravest thing I saw in 3 days of a collapsing world. She said, "Yes," when we both knew it might be a lie, and she got to her feet using my shoulder, and she stood swaying in the killing heat and nodded once. We made a chain, Priya on point, because she was fastest and had the clearest eyes. Then Grace with Biscuit on a leash of knotted extension cord. Then Renata, one hand on my arm, and me at the back, walking backward half the time, watching the shapes drifting in the dark. The plan was simple and insane. Go now. Go quiet. Use the generator's noise to cover our own. Get to the cool house before Renata's heart quit or the infected turned around. I have replayed the seconds before we opened the garage door more times than I've replayed anything in my life. Renata's hand on my forearm, cool and damp. Priya's shoulders squared in the dark, my daughter volunteering for the front. Grace murmuring to the dog, low and steady, the voice of a woman who'd calmed 31 years of frightened children. Biscuit's ears flat, and his whole body trembling. And the heat, even at night, pressing on all of us, the enemy we were walking through to escape the enemy we were walking toward. I thought, if this goes wrong, This is the last arrangement of my family I will ever have known whole. Then I opened the door, and the outside air was somehow both cooler than the house and full of the smell of the dead, and we went. We got 10 yards, 20. The generator roared its beautiful, terrible roar. The shapes clustered around the Vance's side yard, drawn to the sound, their backs half to us. 30 yards. Renata's grip was slackening on my arm, and her breath was coming in that hitching way, and I was doing math again. The awful math. Distance over the speed of a failing heart. And the answer was too close to call. And then Biscuit, a poor, traumatized Biscuit, who flinched at raised hands, who'd been through his own private apocalypse long before ours saw the shapes in the dark. And every instinct in that dog's body overrode his fear. And he barked. Once, twice. Loud and sharp, and aimed right at the cluster of infected at the Vances, who turned all of them, all at once, away from the generator and toward the sound of something alive and afraid and 40 feet away in the open. There's a particular silence that happens in the half-second after everything goes wrong, when your brain finishes calculating and hasn't yet let your body know the answer. I stood in that silence. I watched 5 infected shapes pivot toward my family in the open dark, and I understood that the plan was dead, that the noise cover was gone, that we were 4 people and a dog stranded halfway between 2 houses, with the fast heat in one and the slow dead in the other. Grace moved before I did. 71 years old, 31 years of standing between 4th graders and chaos. And she did the thing that career had built into her. She put herself between the danger and the people who couldn't move fast. She dropped Biscuit's leash, and she shoved Renata toward me, and she said, "Get her to the cool house. Go. I'll bring the dog around the long way." And she turned and slapped her hands together at the infected, loud, drawing them. An old woman making herself into a target because she'd done the math too. And she'd gotten the same answer I had, that Renata could not outrun them, and someone had to buy the seconds. I want to tell you I refused. I want to tell you I was noble. But Renata was folding again, her heart finally losing its fight with the heat, going down in my arms in the middle of the cul-de-sac. And I had a choice measured in seconds. Catch my wife and run for the cool house, or go back for the woman I'd brought under my roof 2 days ago. I caught my wife. I ran for the cool house. I left Grace Okonkwo in the open dark, drawing the dead away from us. And I have to live in the specific truth that I did not even hesitate. That the math was instant and total, and I obeyed it the way I'd spent my whole career watching desperate people obey it. And now I was the desperate person, and the math didn't care about the tomatoes she'd brought us, or the 4th graders she'd taught, or the husband she'd wanted to die beside. Priya and I got Renata through the Vance's broken door into the cool. The air hit her like medicine. I laid her on the cool tile floor in front of the air vent, and her breathing changed almost at once, the hitch smoothing, her heart finding its rhythm again in air that finally let it work. She was going to live. The cool house was going to save her, exactly as I'd gambled. And through the window, 40 yards away, in the light spilling from a dead family's home that I had broken into and lit up like a stage, I watched an old schoolteacher and a frightened greyhound do the thing that actually saved my wife. Which was not the generator, and not my planning, and not my terrible arithmetic, but a stranger's simple decision to be the one who stayed behind. Grace made it to the neighbor's fence. Biscuit made it over. Grace did not. I'm not going to describe it. She wouldn't have wanted the audience, and the darkness was a mercy that let me not see all of it. And there are some things a man gets to keep even from himself. What I'll say is that it was fast, faster than the heat, And that in the last clear second, before the shapes closed around her, she looked back across the cul-de-sac at the lit window of the cool house. At us. At the family she'd bought 40 yards for. And I've chosen to believe because a man has to choose to believe something to keep going. That what was on her face was not fear, but the particular piece of a person who has, at the very end, been unmistakably useful. Priya was screaming. I held her back from the door with both arms, because going out there would only add her body to the arithmetic. And I said her name over and over into her hair while she fought me. And behind us, Renata's heart beat steady and cool and alive on a stranger's floor. And Biscuit scratched at the Vance's back door until Priya let him in and buried her face in his fur and wept. We stayed in the cool house. Of course we did. That was the whole point, the thing Grace died to complete. We stayed in that dead family's cool rooms with the generator roaring and the air conditioning flooding through us. And Renata's heart came back to itself hour by hour. And I found the Vance's liquor cabinet and did not touch it because Renata had asked me to keep my character, and it was the one thing left I could still give her. And I sat up all that second night in a comfort that had cost a life. The comfort was obscene. That's the only word for it. To be cool, actually cool. 70-something degrees, my skin dry for the first time in 2 days, while an old woman lay in the dark 40 yards away, because she'd bought us the crossing. I kept getting up to check the temperature, and each time the number was merciful, and each time the mercy felt like an accusation. Priya slept eventually. Biscuit curled against her, both of them twitching through whatever dreams the day had loaded into them. Renata drifted in and out, and every time she surfaced, she found my hand, checking I was still there, and every time I was. Around midnight, the infected that had followed Grace's noise drifted back into our part of the street, drawn now by the generator again. And they gathered in the Vance's yard and stood there in the spill of light from the windows, swaying, patient, held off by nothing but a locked door and a pane of glass I'd broken myself. I watched them from inside the cool, and I understood the final architecture of the trap I'd built. The same machine keeping my wife alive was calling the dead to our walls. And there was no version of the night where I got the one without the other. Safety and danger came through the same wire. They always had. I just hadn't been able to see it until I was the one holding the switch. Around 3 a.m, in the cool dark, Renata found my hand. "It wasn't your fault," she said, because she knew me, because she'd felt me doing the math even in her half-conscious state. "You caught me because I was falling. That's not a crime. That's a husband." "I didn't hesitate," I said. "I want you to know that. When it was you or her, I didn't even hesitate." She was quiet. Then, "No, you didn't." She didn't tell me it was okay. That was the kindest thing she could have done. And she did it. She let it be as heavy as it actually was. She didn't lift 1 ounce of it off me. Because she understood that a man who's let someone die for him doesn't need absolution. He needs to be trusted to carry it. "You didn't hesitate," she said again. "And you're going to remember her name every day for the rest of your life. And both of those things are going to be true at the same time, forever. That's what you get to keep, Dale. Not a clear conscience. Her name. Grace Okonkwo. 4th grade, 31 years. Brought us tomatoes we couldn't eat. I keep it the way she asked me to keep it. I keep her name. The power came back on the 3rd day. Not the grid stayed dead for another 11 days. But the National Guard rolled a convoy of cooling trucks and generators into our valley on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Big diesel units, and a man with a bullhorn directing survivors to a cooling center they'd set up in the high school gym. And just like that, the emergency that had nearly killed us, became a thing with a solution. An official response, a plan that finally matched the actual disaster. We heard the trucks before we saw them. Priya was at the window and she said, "Dad?" in a voice I hadn't heard since the first afternoon, except this time the bottom wasn't dropped out of it. This time it had something in it I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Ugly, exhausted, disbelieving hope. I stood in the Vance's cool living room and I listened to the sound of rescue arriving. And I felt the strangest thing. Not relief, or not only relief. I felt something close to fury, though it took me years to name it right. Because the trucks had come, and they would have come whether or not I broke into that house, whether or not I lit that generator, whether or not Grace stayed behind, in the dark. If we had simply endured, if we had lain on the cool concrete of our own garage and rationed water and waited out 3 days, Renata might have survived to see those trucks anyway. Might have. Or her heart might have quit on the second night. I would never know. The disaster had forced a choice on me under a clock I couldn't read, and Grace had paid for a margin I would never be able to prove we'd needed. That's the part of a heat disaster that the zombies could never do to us. The infected made things simple. See it, run from it, fight it, clear. There was a terrible cleanliness to them, a threat you could point at, a decision you could be right or wrong about, and know which within seconds. But the heat made everything a gamble with the odds hidden, a bet placed in the dark with someone else's life as the stake. And no way ever to go back and check whether you'd bet right. The infected killed a few people on our street in 3 days. The heat was working on all of us at once, every hour, the whole time. And it never had to make a decision, never had to choose, never had to hunt. It just sat on the roof and waited. And the waiting was the weapon. I think that's why the official plan failed us so completely. Shelter in place is advice built for a world with a monster you can lock out. Nobody writes emergency protocols for the house itself becoming the emergency. And when the two disasters overlapped, the one you fight and the one you can only endure, every instinct we had was calibrated for the wrong one. We fortified against the slow dead and got cooked by the weather. And I don't think we were stupid. I think we were human. And human beings are built to fear the thing with teeth, not the thing with a temperature. We walked to the cooling center that evening. The 4 of us. Renata leaning on me, but walking, upright, alive. Priya with Biscuit on his knotted cord leash. Me carrying nothing because I'd left everything in the Vance's house exactly as Renata had asked, along with a note on the kitchen counter with our name and a list of what we'd used and the words "we'll pay it back" and "we're sorry and thank you." And under that, because she made me. Because it was the truth. Grace Okonkwo died saving us in your driveway. She was a good woman. Ask about her. The high school gym was the coldest room I'd ever been in, and it was maybe 78 degrees. That's what 3 days had done to us. 78 degrees felt Arctic. People lay on cots under the industrial air handlers with expressions I recognized from Grace's face in the dark, the peace of the finally, physically safe. There were maybe 200 of us. A nurse checked Renata's heart and frowned, and put her near the front of a line for evacuation to a hospital that still had power. And I watched my wife get wheeled toward help, and I understood we were going to make it, all of us, out of a thing that had killed the woman 2 doors down. I found the man with the bullhorn, and I told him about Grace. I made myself do it. I told him her name and her address and what she'd done, and I asked him to write it down, to put it in whatever record they were keeping, so that when this was over and people counted the dead, she wouldn't be a number in the heat-related fatality column that I'd read so many times in so many actuarial tables without ever once seeing a face. He wrote it down. It wasn't enough. Nothing was going to be enough. But it was the thing I could do. So I did it. Priya sat against the gym wall with Biscuit's head in her lap, and she said without looking at me, "I keep thinking about how we barricaded the front door that first day. The couch, remember? We were so sure. We thought we'd figured it out." She laughed. That ugly laugh. My laugh. I'd given her that at least. We locked ourselves in. We locked ourselves in with a thing that was actually killing us, and we felt safe. "I know," I said. "The zombies didn't even really try, Dad. Like there were some, and it was scary. But they weren't the thing. We could have handled the zombies." She finally looked at me, 19 years old and 100 years older than 3 days ago. It was the heat. It was 3 days without power in our own house. That's what almost got us. Not the monsters, the weather. I sat down next to my daughter on the cold floor of a high school gym in the blessed manufactured chill. And I put my arm around her. And I didn't correct her because she was right. And because being right about a thing like that is its own kind of wound. And there was nothing I could teach her about it that the last 3 days hadn't already carved into her deeper than I ever could. Outside, the sun finally went down on the third day. Inside, for the first time since 2:14 on a Tuesday afternoon, I was cold, and my whole family was breathing, minus one who wasn't mine, and who I'd keep anyway, forever, by name. The grid came back 11 days later. We moved home. The Vances came back in October and found our note and knocked on our door. And I stood on my own porch and told the whole thing to 2 strangers whose generator had saved my wife's life. And they cried, and I cried, and they told me to keep the note. I keep a lot of things now. People ask what it was like, surviving the outbreak. And they want to hear about the infected, the hinge sounds, the crossing, the dead in the dark. I let them think that was the story. It's easier. But the truth is, the dead were slow and simple, and I understood them. What I couldn't survive, what none of us are built to survive, was the ordinary thing turned lethal. The air in our own house, the weather app's little animated flame. 3 days of a sun on a black roof doing patiently what no monster could. I was an insurance man. I spent my life pricing risk. And I'd priced heat wrong my entire career. Filed it under inconvenience, under summer, under the thing you complained about while the AC hummed. It was never inconvenience. It was the quietest killer in the whole disaster. And it took the best person on our street. And it nearly took the center of my life. And it never once had to break down a door. We locked ourselves in against the wrong thing. Almost everybody does. That's the only wisdom I've got, and I'll give it away for free. When the power goes out, and it's 108 degrees, the walls are not on your side. Grace knew what side she was on. I keep her name.